This episode has been brought to you by JustNForm.com. If you're tired of being censored, tired of having your data stolen and sold, go to JustNForm.com, a social media site where all voices are welcome.
Thanks for watching that segment of Mi Casa es Su Casa. You can donate to our Patreon and keep helping the network grow by clicking on the link in the description below. And also, make sure you join us at JustNForm.com. And finally, make sure you subscribe to us on Roku and be part of the very first independent news network on Roku TV. But more than anything else, always remember, find your balance. Peace. So in a move that would seem surprising to some, but unfortunately at this point has become unsurprising to me, Donald Trump has recognized Juan Guaido, the right-wing opposition in Venezuela to Venezuela's government, as the interim president of Venezuela. First of all, who the hell do you think you are? You are right now in the middle. This is the hypocrisy that I cannot stand from Donald Trump. You are in the middle of being falsely accused of being a Russian agent, of being a Putin puppet, as working to further the interests of Russia, and that being your only reason for existing in the presidential office. And yet, for reasons unbeknownst to me, unbeknownst to the average person, but still despicable nonetheless, you are trying to establish a coup in Venezuela. What the hell? You who came in and preached isolationism and non-interventionism. You who came out and preached that going into Syria was a mistake. The reason that many of your supporters allowed you to come into office was because you pretended as if you would not make the same mistakes as a Hillary Clinton. But it seems that in many ways, you are doubling down all the things that she was planning on doing anyway. Yeah, you got it right with North Korea, but then you put troops in Syria anyway, and then pretended that you were taking them out recently, but you were just taking out the troops that you put in there. Although you're still carpet bombing most of Syria, and most of Syria is destroyed at this point, so there's not really any reason to have the troops there. But trust me, Trump isn't as progressive on Syria as many people would like to believe. Why is Donald Trump establishing or trying to establish a coup in Venezuela based off of lies? Well, that's it. It's based off of lies. Now, do I know whether or not Donald Trump believes the lies? Well, at this point, that's irrelevant. But I will say that he is perpetuating the lies. And I want to be very clear about something. The neoliberals who are joining in and trumpeting the overthrow of Maduro, they're literally advocating for a right-wing dictator. Now, many people will believe this is coincidence, but it isn't. See, one thing that you'll learn if you study the history of the United States regime change policies is that coincidentally enough, every single time that we overthrow a government, we always advocate for the right-wing oligarchical dictator. We've done it in Cuba before Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro overthrew him, which is why, for those of you who know, I'm talking about Batista. The Batista Cubans were until recently primarily the Cubans that resided in Miami, which is why so many of them hated Fidel Castro, because Fidel Castro was for desegregation. He was for equity. Now they have 99% literacy rate in Cuba. Now they have a 50-50 male to female ratio in their legislature. Now they have one of the best medical schools in the world where everyone around the world is waiting in line to get into Cuba's medical school. But that means equity for all, and the rich white elites did not like that. Well, where else have we seen this? Remember, we put in the leadership that initiated the South African apartheid, in case you didn't know. And we were behind, in part, the arrest of Nelson Mandela, in case once again you didn't know. We were behind the coup of Grenada. What do all these people have in common? Well, interestingly enough, all of these leaders have one thing in common with both Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez, which is they were for desegregation and they wanted to take control back from the United States to maintain their resources. So in other words, they wanted to take power back away from the oligarchy that put them in the situations that they were currently existing in. Mossadegh in Iran, another example of this. Gaddafi in Libya, another example of this. Assad in Syria, another example of this. I mean, the list truly does go on. There are smaller governments that were overthrown that we don't even hear about in the history books, and it's hard to find out unless you do some really, really deep research to find the connections that lead to one final conclusion, which is the United States has always waged wars on countries with people of color. They've used the lies of the rich white elites of those countries, they've used them to validate going in and overthrowing the governments with regime change. And then they provide asylum to the rich white elites of those countries, rarely questioning their existence in the United States. This is a different type of racism, if you will. But understand that the people who made these policies, the FBI, the CIA, these people were unapologetically racist in the 50s, in the 60s. They were ran by conservatives who thought it was okay to use chemical weapons on people in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, obviously Japan, Iraq, Afghanistan, but didn't think it was okay to use them on the Nazis, even though the Nazis used chemical weapons on us. So these regime change policies have continued from that point on, and we are still seeing the effects of those perpetual regime change policies today. And the same excuses are being used. But I want you to consider one other thing. What do Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and other Middle Eastern countries, including Libya, which is technically West African, but you get the point. What do they all have in common with Venezuela? They are all oil rich or in the path of an oil rich nation. And they all refuse to bend at the will of the petrodollar ran by OPEC and Saudi Arabia. They are all considered to be competition. Because, well, you can't be the number one superpower in the world if you don't have control of the number one oil source. Venezuela has some of the largest oil supplies in the world, so I'm pretty sure that most of you will find it quite surprising that all of a sudden they're poor and they try and blame socialism for that. Well, let's talk about it. So maybe they're trying to say that socialism is causing inflation. Do you know that 70% of the inflation that's caused in Venezuela comes from the rate of exchange from the US dollar? Because the United States doesn't want the world to see Venezuela as what it really is, which has actually been a beacon of progress. It has been. If immortality dropped, good God, it dropped by like 95%. A little bit more, actually. Healthcare became abundantly available. Literacy rate skyrocketed. Social programs were doing and are doing fantastic and have evolved under Hugo Chavez. Now, who do you think dislikes all this progression that we're seeing in Venezuela? The same people who dislike this sort of potential progression in the United States. The oligarchy, the corporatists, the capitalists. Hugo Chavez had to fire people who were working with the oil company in Venezuela, because at one point it was private, because they disliked the fact that that Hugo Chavez was using the money that came from oil to benefit his people, and they weren't able to pocket as much money as they would have liked. So guess what they did when Hugo Chavez got elected? Democratically, I might add. Guess what they did? They tried to shut down the oil supply to the entire nation. You think they have a food shortage in Venezuela? They don't really have a food shortage in Venezuela, people. In fact, just like America, the rich are really, really rich. And they're in a situation where the oligarchy is in control of a lot of the food they make. Polar, which makes 8 of the main food items that are produced in Venezuela, it's ran by a billionaire, of course. Guess what he does? He keeps the food in a warehouse so that the Venezuelan people don't have access to it. And I know some people are thinking, well, what is he going to do with it? He just made it and didn't do anything with it? No, what he does is he puts it out on the black market. So they charge exorbitant prices, which once again contributes to inflation. And then the oligarchs who have large sums of cash money on hand, they withdraw millions and millions of dollars. They take it to Colombia or another country who will exchange with them. And they take the money, exchange it there, spend it there, taking real cash dollars out, or whatever their currency is. They're taking out of Venezuela, leaving less money in their reserves, causing inflation to go up even higher. It's called extraction smuggling. Well, maybe the corrupt government is the reason why things are the way they are. Except for that's not true. The whole idea of the government being corrupt came from a firm called Transparency International. And as you could probably guess, it's backed by none other than the United States and Great Britain. What a surprise, right? But also by ExxonMobil and Shell. Gasp. Nobody could have predicted that. Guess where they got the data for the so-called lack of support for Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez? Guess where they got the data? From an anti-Chavista, in other words, someone who was against the government, who was actually an intricate part of the coup in 2002. Because that is the best way to get objective data. The country, it seems like the United States is never going to learn its lesson. It's so interesting to me that the Democrats always hate Trump until he starts propagating the neoliberal, neoconservative policies of the people who would have otherwise been in office, whether that be Hillary Clinton or whether that had been Jeb Bush, Carly Fiorina. But they are perfectly, Marco Rubio especially, he having a wet dream thinking about a regime regime change in Venezuela. But understand something. I live in Miami where most Venezuelans migrate to. And they have no shame in telling you, to be honest with you. Most of them are white. And they came here because they had the means to, most of the time. Because their family in Venezuela had the means to. It was like, we're pretty high up on the ladder. We have a decent life, but we want a better one. Poor people don't have the option to leave Venezuela. And weirdly enough, those poor people are the ones who supported Chavez and do support Maduro the most. And weirdly enough, and this seems to be the case in Cuba and obviously in South Africa and every other country with people of color that are victims of colonialization, for whatever reason, the black people, the black Venezuelans, the darker skinned Venezuelans who also happen to be the poorer ones, sure that's coincidence, they all support Maduro. And the white rich ones don't support him. They actually support the right wing Trump sycophant. Fan of Trump, acts like Trump. Weirdly enough, Brazil, who also had another Trump wannabe, also supports the coup of Maduro. Isn't that crazy? And Andrew Gillum had the nerve to support Donald Trump after railing against him. I'm so glad he lost, by the way. Ron DeSantis actually hasn't been doing as bad as we thought he would. He's been doing really good for the environment. I'm going to do a video about that, but that's a different discussion. But you get my point, people. We hate Trump. 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 Hold up. Trump said he wants to go to war. We love Trump again. Yay. Because that's the best way to get Trump out of office, by supporting him from the right. And for the Trump sycophants who really believe that what's happening in Venezuela is a result of socialism, wake your dumb ass up. Wake up. It's nothing to do with socialism. Because guess what? Hate to break it to you. Socialism is in Germany, it's in France, it's in Spain, it's in England, it's in Switzerland, it's in Sweden, it's in the Netherlands, it's in Greenland, it's in Iceland, it's in, I mean, I can go on for days. But it seems like the only places we have an issue with that are when they have A, people of color who are in charge, or people in charge who want to see people of color successful. B, they have a resource that we are in dire need of, which may be oil, diamonds, gold, etc. And C, when they have two of those things and the leadership refuses to bend at the will of the Western establishment. And until you understand that, you will continue to look like fools. You want to keep using Venezuela in your examples? Well, make sure you tell them all the statistics I just quoted you. How the reason their inflation is so high and the reason they have such an economic problem is because of things like extraction, smuggling, taking the cash out of the country by the oligarchs who are opposed to the government because the government wants to take care of the people more than it wants to take care of the corporations, which is what I thought that you all want, right? You get tired of crony capitalism, then when you have a leader who wants to hold crony capitalism accountable and exterminate it from its country, all of a sudden you have a problem with it. Quote the statistic that 70% of the inflation comes from the US dollar, deeming Venezuela's dollar irrelevant. Which, weirdly enough, we also call it a coup. Or excuse me, we also planning a coup in Venezuela, and we want the government usurped. I'm sure that has nothing to do with it. Because think about it. Every other country who is oil rich, we give them preference. We give their currency preference. But not in Venezuela. Couldn't do that. Couldn't treat them like we treat other oil and rich nations. Not while the state has control of the oil supply. You know who else had a very, 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 very similar situation? Mossadegh in Iran. And it's weird because it's 2019. We're still doing the same. We're not even trying anymore because they know people are going to be dumb enough to believe it. Mossadegh, democratically elected, we said that he was not, with absolutely no proof. Why do we do that? Well, he wanted to nationalize the oil supply and keep the Western world out of their money. What do we label him as? A communist, a socialist. You know how the spiel goes. What happened next? Well, right-wing theocratic government. What a surprise! It seems like every time this happens, we want to institute a right-wing government. Why? Because the right-wing oligarchs are easy to control. They are power hungry. They want to make sure black people aren't successful, and they want money. It's easy to keep those people under control, which is why, and they will stamp out any opposition unapologetically. We're going to learn eventually. We're going to learn eventually.